Whether you're a longtime Zelda fan or a newcomer to the series, chances are you're at least familiar with the Lost Woods. It's a recurring location dating back all the way to the very first title, and has always had a sense of mystery attached to it. Its reputation is mainly that of a dense, forbidden forest that is hard to navigate, causing some to get lost, hence the name. There have been quite a lot of iterations of the Lost Woods, each with their own rules, atmosphere, and end goal. Sometimes it's the resting place of the Master Sword, sometimes it houses a dungeon, or both. It differs for each game. Now, in most games the forest is simply very confusing, and those who are unlucky or ill-prepared run the risk of becoming irreversibly lost forever, never to be seen again. But there's one version of the Lost Woods that stands out from all the others, that being the one from Ocarina of Time. The reason it stands out is because here, the punishment for getting lost is a lot more severe and honestly quite disturbing. Getting lost and potentially dying of exhaustion, dehydration, or starvation is already bad enough. But in Ocarina of Time, legends say that those who find themselves lost will be cursed to wander the forest for all eternity. But is any of this true? Are the souls of the unfortunate really wandering the forest? Or are these simply old folktales, perhaps to deter people from setting foot inside? A way to protect the forest and the secrets that lie within? As far as the claims about the Lost Woods go, there's only one example of something close to a first-hand witness account that potentially proves the validity of these stories. An individual who's been bold enough or reckless enough to venture inside the forbidden parts of the forest, never to be seen again. This will be a two-part theory about the Lost Woods in Ocarina of Time and to a smaller extent Majora's Mask. In today's video we'll be looking at the woods themselves and the stories surrounding them, and in part 2, which will be released soon after, we will attempt to shed some light on the missing persons case and the mysterious circumstances surrounding his disappearance based on today's findings. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into the curse of the Lost Woods. The stories surrounding the Lost Woods are not as straightforward as it may seem. There is a degree of uncertainty, misunderstandings, and even contradictory information about the rules the sacred forest abides to, especially when it comes to some of the consequences and punishment. The forest as a whole is made up of 3 primary locations: the Kokiri Forest, where the children of the forest live, the Lost Woods themselves, and the Sacred Forest Meadow, which also houses the ever-so-mysterious Forest Temple. Although separate areas, each of these locations ultimately makes up the forest as a whole. So when people in the game talk about the forest, they can be referring to any of these locations. The Kokiri Forest is, as stated before, the home of the forest children, known as the Kokiri. One thing to note right off the bat is that yes, the Kokiri are the same entities as the Koroks, who show up for the first time in the Wind Waker. Here it's explained that after the events of Ocarina of Time, the Kokiri took on the form of the Koroks following the Great Flood. We even meet the ghost of a sage who is confirmed to be the ancestor of the Koroks, who still takes on the form of a Kokiri child, akin to the ones from Ocarina of Time. One rule states that the children of the forest can never leave the area, as they will die if they do. But there's been a lot of debate about how this even works, and if it's even true to begin with. The biggest reason why people have put this into question is because during the credits of Ocarina of Time, the Kokiri are seen celebrating alongside the other inhabitants of Hyrule. And this celebration takes place on Lon Lon Ranch, far outside the forest. Now, there could be many reasons why this is possible. Nobody ever makes it clear how and why a Kokiri would die if they step outside the forest. The Kokiri themselves take it very seriously and seem to think that it spells instant death for them if they try. But again, we never see the effect it has on them. Some suggest that they simply lose their immortality if they leave and grow old and die. Others think that because the Kokiri are vulnerable children, the dangers of the outside world is what gets them. Yet others claim that this entire story is simply a lie made up by the Deku Tree to discourage them from leaving. I myself think it's a combination of the last two. The story may have indeed been made up. It wouldn't be the first time that the Deku Tree used a white lie to keep secrets. Case in point being Link's true origin as a Hylian, which he didn't disclose until after Link was already an adult and never told any of the other Kokiri about it. This was of course to Link's own benefit. He sensed great destiny in him and wanted to keep him safe until he was ready to fulfill said destiny. The Deku Tree's purpose is protecting and watching over the forest and the spirits that dwell within, and it's likely that a Kokiri out on his own would run the risk of death if faced with monsters or other threats from the outside world. I, however, don't think that there's any magic involved, where a Kokiri would magically drop dead upon leaving the forest or lose their immortality and die a slow death. And there's a couple of reasons why I think this is not the case. The first is that there's no evidence of a Kokiri who lost their immortality in any of the games. We never meet a former Kokiri who has chosen a mortal life outside the forest. Second is the fact that in every other game, the spirits of the forest are able to leave just fine. In fact, in the case of the Wind Waker, the Deku Tree even encourages them to leave, to, spread his seeds so the forest can expand. And of course in Breath of the Wild they're all over the place. Lastly, there's a gossip stone right outside Link's house which says, "They say that one Kokiri has left the forest, but he's still alive." Now, of course, this could be referring to Link himself, but there are some problems with that idea. The Gossip Stone is already there before Link leaves the forest, first of all, and second, Link isn't a Kokiri, he's a Hylian. So could it be that this Gossip Stone isn't referring to Link, and is instead talking about a real Kokiri who secretly left the forest one day and has lived to tell the tale? Maybe, but as to who this mysterious Kokiri would be is anyone's guess. So whether true or not, this is the rule set to apply to those who call the forest home. But what about the other way around? What happens to outsiders trying to enter? Well, this is where we get to the most notorious part about the Lost Woods in Ocarina of Time. It is said that those from the outside world who enter the forest and end up getting lost will transform into a monster and find themselves trapped here forever. Additionally, their age will dictate what shape they will take on. Lost children are said to transform into a skull kid, little forest imps made of wood, and if it's an adult, they will take on the form of a stalfos, the wandering remains of a skeleton turned to a hostile monster. Again, we have to ask ourselves, is any of this true? Do outsiders really transform into cursed monstrosities? Or is it potentially yet another lie or fairy tale, this time to keep people out as opposed to keeping them in? Let's start with the Skull Kids. One theory I disagree with is the idea that Kokiri who get lost in the woods turn into Skull Kids. I've read about this idea in a couple of different places, most notably on Zelda Wiki, which says that, quote, "There is speculation about whether or not Kokiri or Hylian children turn into Skull Kids. It is more plausible that Kokiri turn into Skull Kids due to the fact that they stay children for their whole lives." And it further states that, quote, "Skull Kids appear to be made of wood, and later games make it clear that Kokiri are related to the tree-like Koroks, who also hide their faces with masks." And yes, there are some similarities between the Koroks and the Skull Kids, but for me personally, it's not enough to come to this conclusion. I'd even argue that there is more evidence that contradicts it. We know for a fact that the Skull Kids and the Kokiri have a friendly relationship with each other. They are said to play with them, and Saria has even taught her famous song to one of them. This is also confirmed to be the very same Skull Kid who later plays a big role in Majora's Mask. At the end of the game, he remarks that Link has the same smell as the fairy kid who taught him a song in the woods. That fairy kid, of course, being Saria, who did indeed teach him the song and was allegedly even friends with him, as Mido points out that she only taught the song to close friends. So, as far as counter evidence goes, if the Lost Woods are so dangerous that they could make a Kokiri who accidentally makes a wrong turn transform into a Skull Kid, why would the Deku Tree allow them to go inside in the first place? Because that's what they do. Saria has her own secret spot in the forest meadow, and both Mido and Fado are seen visiting the Lost Woods as well. On top of that, one of them even says to Link, "If you're looking for Saria, she's in the Lost Woods, as usual. I know you'll get lost, but don't worry, you'll just end up back at the entrance." I doubt that if the Kokiri ran any risk of being cursed and turned into a Skull Kid, they would be so casual about it. Some have used this line from one of the Kokiri as evidence, that one of the quote-unquote forest kids was complaining about their face. Some seem to think that they are referring to a Kokiri who was complaining about their face. And because there's a Skull Kid who does something similar, that Skull Kid must have been a former Kokiri that they knew. But if you ask me, it's pretty obvious that they are simply referring directly to the Skull Kid and not one of their Kokiri friends. The term forest kid is probably just a name that the Kokiri used to describe them. It's clearly meant to be a hint hint as to who to sell the skull mask to. In Kakariko Village we find a similar hint about the kid from the graveyard. Lastly, there is a gossip stone that sheds some more light on the story about the Lost Woods, stating that they say that when non-fairy folk enter the Lost Woods, they become monsters. The term non-fairy folk is of course already pretty damning for the Kokiri Skull Kid theory, but it's also important to note that Skull Kids are not monsters, they are spirits, something we'll get back to later. For now, let's move on to adults and their transformation into stalfos. The lore behind this transformation stems from a conversation with one of the Kokiri girls inside the Lost Woods. There's two versions of this conversation, one from the original and one from the 3DS title, which is slightly different. On the N64 she says, "Anybody who comes into the forest will be lost. Everybody will become a stalfos. Everybody, stalfos." But on the 3DS, she says, "Except for the Kokiri, people who come into the forest end up lost. They all become stalfos." Notice that on the 3DS they added the phrase, "except for the Kokiri." Another reason to believe that the Kokiri are not the ones who get lost and turn into Skull Kids. This conversation also ties directly into our missing persons case, which we'll cover next time. But let's just say for now that his disappearance stands as the most compelling piece of evidence that at least parts of the legends about the Lost Woods may in fact be true, and that he has indeed been lost to the forest, cursed to live his life as a skeletal monstrosity for who knows how long, maybe until Link or someone else puts him out of his misery. But there's a couple of things that never sat right with me regarding this case, and maybe there's a lot more to it than we are led to believe. It doesn't have to be, of course, maybe the simplest answer is also the right one, but this wouldn't be much of a theory video if we didn't at least try to come up with an alternative. The first and most obvious question people have asked is, of course, why do the Lost Woods not affect Link? I mean, he is a Hylian after all. But to be fair, I don't think this necessarily takes away from the possibility that the Lost Woods are indeed cursed, because the gossip stone we mentioned earlier does clearly say that non-fairy folk are said to turn into monsters, and Link does have a fairy. It's easy to believe that guardian fairies can somehow protect their companion against the curse. What it doesn't explain, however, is how Hylians and perhaps other races were able to build all these structures inside the forest. There's man-made entrances to Zora's Domain and Goron City, as well as of course the huge forest temple. If the woods are cursed, how did they manage to build all of this and not get affected by it? Now you might say, well, maybe the curse didn't go into effect until after the forest temple fell, but that doesn't seem to add up either. After all, some of the Skull Kids, particularly the one from Majora's Mask, have been around since ancient times. This means that if the stories about children turning into Skull Kids are true, the curse has to have been around for a very, very long time. Now, the Forest Temple is very much haunted by ghosts and monsters, including stalfos, but the general consensus is that this is because a battle took place here, and the temple was at some point invaded, leading to the demise of its occupants, who then continued to linger inside. Their resurrection may have even been solely Ganondorf's doing, as Saria does state that the temple has only recently become infested by monsters. The stories surrounding the Forest Temple are too much to cover in this video, but if you want to check out some cool theories about it, I will add one by VortexxyGaming as well as one from Zeltik in the description below. Either way, it's clear that there has been Hylian activity in the Lost Woods, possibly as late as the Hyrulean Civil War, which ended only a few years before Link started his adventure. While the presence of stalfos inside the Forest Temple does seem to hint that the curse is real, this isn't the only option. If adults who enter the forest indeed turn into stalfos, how come we only find them inside the temple and nowhere else in the forest? Why are they also found inside the Shadow Temple and Ganon's castle, among other places? Before we can try to answer these questions, we first have to determine what a stalfos even is in the first place. The game itself doesn't have much to say about them other than how to defeat it, but I did find two passages in Hyrule Historia and Encyclopedia, two books which seem to be a bit at odds with each other when it comes to the lore behind the stalfos. Historia simply repeats what's already been established by the game itself, that adults turn into stalfos and children into Skull Kids, and that both are doomed to wander the woods. However, Encyclopedia adds to the stalfos lore and suggests that they are specifically the resurrected remains of soldiers who fell in battle. They have retained parts of their memory, in particular their combat skills. Now, normally I'm not one to choose a book over a game, but since the game doesn't have much to say about the stalfos, for the theory at hand I think it's fair to at least take the books into consideration. While they do without a doubt hold information that is questionable, possible retcons or flat out mistakes, at the same time there's also plenty of stuff that has been accepted as canon, like, you know, the official Zelda timeline, or the fact that the hero Shade is the hero of time, which was just a theory until the book confirmed it. Obviously, I'm biased because I'm trying to build a theory, so take it with a grain of salt. But for now, let's go with the notion that stalfos are indeed dead soldiers. To me, this simply makes the most sense, given their weapons and combat skills. This makes the appearance of stalfos in places like Ganon's Castle, the Shadow Temple and Forest Temple make perfect sense. These would have been locations where soldiers were to be stationed. A wartime prison for the enemies of the royal family, the remains of Hyrule Castle, which previously housed plenty of soldiers, and a mysterious stronghold inside a forest where a battle took place. So then, why would our missing person turn into a stalfos? He's not a soldier, we know that. You'd expect him to turn into a Redead or something. In fact, he already looks a bit like a Redead. We also never actually witness him as a stalfos in the game, even after clearing the Forest Temple first. Nor do we see other stalfos outside the Forest Temple. So could it be that the legends behind the stalfos and maybe even the Skull Kid transformations are in fact just that? Legends. We've already demonstrated that the stories about the Kokiri dying when they leave the forest could have been a lie. This opens up the possibility that the same thing applies to the mythos surrounding the Lost Woods. At the very least, it could have been a misinterpretation. People undoubtedly went missing in the forest and were never seen again. Maybe people witnessed Skull Kids and the stalfos in and around the Forest Temple and simply drew the conclusion that these must be the remains of these missing people, while in fact the two could be unrelated. Similar to Poes, who are said to be the spirits of the undead unable to move on to the afterlife because of hatred or unfulfilled desires, maybe stalfos are indeed the remains of dead soldiers who are also unable to find peace after they perished in battle. As for the Skull Kids, they could simply be just another type of forest spirit, just like the Kokiri, and may have no connection to Hylian children at all. Spirits come in all sorts of different forms in the Zelda universe, from dragons to great fairies, little woodland imps to other mysterious creatures. Not saying that Skull Kids cannot possibly have been Hylian children in their past lives, I'm just saying that it could also be a myth. No Skull Kid has ever shed light on what they are, who they were in a past life, or anything else about their kind. They are to this day a bit of an enigma, so it's not hard to believe that the Hylians may have misunderstood them and made up stories about their origin due to a lack of knowledge. The use of words like "it is said" and "they say" does seem to reflect that these are stories being passed down and not necessarily solid facts. It is of course also noteworthy that this is the only game where the Lost Woods act this way. In any other game, it's just a mysterious place where people can potentially get lost. There's no mentions of transforming into the undead or becoming spirits or anything else like it. In A Link to the Past, some people, like thieves, even live and hide inside the forest to avoid persecution. I do realize that not all iterations of the Lost Woods are the same place, but it is a bit strange that this legendary curse only exists here and nowhere else. So, are the Lost Woods cursed? We may never know for sure. The fact that people have been speculating and debating these mysteries for so many years is a testament to the fact that the game doesn't spell it out clear as day. Although the disappearance of one of the game's NPCs is definitely suspicious, like I said, we never actually witnessed them turning into a stalfos. All we have is hearsay, and as we all know, not every story told ends up being true. So in the next video, we'll take a closer look at our missing persons case. We'll look at their background and the circumstances, and do a little Sherlock Holmes detective work to see if there's more to this story than we initially thought. Until then, I hope to see you in the next video. This is Dawn signing off, and have a good one.